Demand for electric vehicles is so strong, a Chinese car manufacturer has just made history in Melbourne. For the first time, BYD has brought its own car carrier vessel to Australia, and the brand chases Toyota for the #1 spot when it comes to sales down under.
On a grey morning at the Port of Melbourne, a ship pulled alongside the dock that did not look like anything unusual. It was long, white and box-shaped, with a hull that rose out of the water like the side of an apartment building. Nothing about it made the news. Then the ramp came down at the stern and cars started rolling out, not being lifted out by crane, not being unpacked from containers, driving out under their own power, one after another, down a steel ramp and onto Australian soil. 4,809 of them. And every single one carried the same badge on the hood as the name painted on the side of the ship. That is the part almost nobody has noticed. The company that built those cars also owns the ship that carried them. It owns the terminal slot. It owns the battery inside every vehicle on all 16 decks. In under 2 years, a Chinese battery company that started out making cell phone batteries in a rented factory quietly assembled a fleet of 8 ocean-going vessels capable of moving more than 1 million cars a year across every ocean on the planet. It did this while the shipping industry that had controlled that trade for 50 years watched, waited, and assumed nothing would really change. It changed. And the people who should have seen it coming were the ones with the fewest excuses, because they had spent the previous decade paying fines for the reason it happened. If you like stories like this one, hit the like button before we get going, because these take a serious amount of digging to pull together, and every like genuinely helps push it in front of more people. Subscribe too, so the next one finds you. What follows is the story of how a car company decided that owning the ocean was cheaper than renting it, and how an entire industry handed over the keys without ever quite realizing it had done so. But to understand why that matters, you first have to understand how strange it is. Because for half a century, car companies did not own ships. That was somebody else's job, and it was one of the most profitable jobs in global trade. Go back to the mid-1960s. Japan is rebuilding, and it is about to do something nobody expects. Japanese car makers start selling vehicles to America in numbers that make everyone uncomfortable. But there is a problem, and it is a boring one. How do you get a car across the Pacific? At the time, you did it the way you moved any awkward cargo. You drove the car into a giant net or a wooden cradle. A crane lifted it off the dock, swung it over the water, and lowered it into the hold of a general cargo ship. It was slow. It was expensive. It scratched paint, dented panels, and every so often it dropped a car into the harbour. Loading a few hundred vehicles could take days. By 2022, it had roughly doubled. By 2023, the average was over $72,000 a day. And by early 2024, the spot figure for that same class of ship hit $115,000 a day. That is a rate that went up roughly 9 times over in 3 years. If you were a car maker without your own ships, your logistics cost per vehicle did not creep upward. It detonated. And there was a further insult. Even if you were willing to pay, there was frequently nothing to pay for. Ships were fully booked. Owners could pick and choose their customers, and unsurprisingly, they favoured the customers they had been serving for 30 years over new entrants shipping unfamiliar electric cars out of ports that had never handled export volume before. Some Chinese manufacturers got so desperate they resorted to shipping cars inside ordinary shipping containers, which is roughly as elegant as it sounds, involves specialised racking, wastes a huge amount of space, and is significantly more expensive per vehicle. Analysts later estimated around 1 million cars a year were moving that way out of China at the peak, purely because proper car carrier space could not be found. So by 2022, the picture was clear to anyone who cared to look. A concentrated group of shipping companies with a documented history of coordinating prices. A structural shortage of vessels that would take years to fix. charter rates approaching the point where ocean freight cost more than the profit margin on the car being freighted. Every car maker on the planet could see this. Every single one. The information was public, the numbers were in the trade press, and the fines were in the newspapers. In 2022 and 2023, while charter rates were climbing towards six figures a day, BYD went to Chinese shipyards and started ordering vessels, not one as a trial. 8 simultaneously across multiple yards. The reaction outside China ranged from mild amusement to polite dismissal. The consensus view was that this was a vanity project, that a car maker had no business running ships, that they would discover the operational complexity the hard way, and that when the rate cycle turned, as rate cycles always do, they would be stuck holding hundreds of millions of dollars of depreciating steel while everyone else went back to chartering cheaply. It was, on paper, a reasonable position. It was also completely wrong, and understanding why requires looking at what these ships actually are, because they are considerably stranger and more sophisticated than a floating car park. The first vessel, BYD Explorer No.1, was delivered in January 2024. It is 199.9 meters long and 38 meters wide, with capacity for 7,000 car equivalent units. Its maiden voyage carried more than 5,000 electric vehicles from China to Vlissingen in the Netherlands and Bremerhaven in Germany. But the headline numbers are not the interesting part. The interesting part is the propulsion. The ship burns liquefied natural gas as its primary fuel, fed from 2 Type C storage tanks, with conventional marine fuel as a backup. Running on gas, it still makes 19 knots and has a range of 15,800 nautical miles, which is enough to sail from Shenzhen to Rotterdam and be most of the way back without refueling. Between January 2024 and September 2025, 8 vessels entered service. Explorer No.1 came first, then Changzhou, Hefei, Shenzhen, Xi'an, Changsha, Zhengzhou, and finally Jinan. 7 of the 8 are named after Chinese cities where BYD has a vehicle production base, which is a quiet piece of symbolism in itself. Depending on the class, each carries either around 7,000 or around 9,200 cars. Together, the completed fleet gives the company an annual ocean transport capacity of well over 1 million vehicles. The company built that fleet from first delivery to last in under 2 years. Now for the part that turns an interesting logistics story into something with wider consequences. Ask what those ships were actually for, and the obvious answer is that they carry BYD's exports. That is true, and the export numbers explain why the capacity was needed. In 2023, BYD sold roughly 243,000 vehicles outside China. In 2025, that figure was 1,046,083, a jump of over 150% in a single year. In the first half of 2026, the company sold 792,256 vehicles overseas, up nearly 71% year on year, and in June of that year, it exported a record 175,349 vehicles in 1 month. Overseas sales had gone from a rounding error to 43% of everything the company sold. In the United Kingdom, it became the best-selling electric vehicle brand outright. In Australia, it went from a standing start in 2023 to more than 8% of the entire new car market by May 2026. But the deeper answer is about control, and control turns out to be worth more than the freight saving. When you own the ships, you decide the sailing schedule, and you can align it with your production schedule rather than with a shipping line's rotation. When demand doubles in a market, you can move capacity toward it in weeks instead of negotiating for space that may not exist. When a route becomes dangerous or a canal becomes impassable, you make the routing decision yourself. When a port is congested, you reprioritize. None of that shows up cleanly on a balance sheet, and all of it decides whether a customer waits 6 weeks or 6 months for a car. In a market where a dozen brands are selling broadly similar electric vehicles at broadly similar prices, being the one that can actually deliver is not a small advantage. And BYD was not alone. This is where the shift stops being one company's clever move and becomes a structural change in an entire trade. SAIC Motor, another Chinese manufacturer, has been building through its logistics arm at even greater scale. In May 2025, it launched a 9,500 vehicle carrier, taking the size crown yet again, and by the end of that year, its fleet across river. Coastal and deep sea vessels stood at 41 ships. Sherry and Jack formed a car carrier joint venture with a state-owned shipping group. A joint venture involving COSCO, the Shanghai Port Authority, and SAIC had 24 ro-ro vessels under construction across 4 Chinese yards at once. Estimates a few years ago had China holding the world's 8th largest car carrier fleet with 33 vessels, and on course to hold the 4th largest by 2028. That was an underestimate of the pace. Underneath all of it sits the factor that made the entire thing possible, and it is the one most people outside shipping have never thought about. You cannot build a fleet in 2 years unless somebody can build ships in 2 years. China can. In 2025, Chinese yards took roughly 63% of all new shipbuilding orders worldwide by compensated tonnage, with China's own ministry putting the figure closer to 69%, along with 56% of all completed deliveries. In the first half of 2026, Chinese yards won 1,131 of the 1,481 vessels ordered globally, around 72% of the market. South Korea, the nearest competitor, took about a fifth. Japan, which invented the modern car carrier, fell to roughly 1% of new orders, its lowest share in 3 decades. That is the piece that connects everything. BYD did not simply decide to own ships. It decided to own ships in the one country on earth where the shipyards, the steel, the financing and the engineering talent were all sitting in the same place, at the same time hungry for orders. A European or American manufacturer making the identical decision in 2022 would have found a queue years long and a price to match, and would have ended up ordering from a Chinese yard anyway. The only genuine question was who. The incumbents assumed it would be them, on their timeline, at their pace. It was not. When they finally did move, the market had moved further. By 2024, shipyards delivered 44 car carriers, 4 times the 11 delivered in 2023. In 2024 alone, 75 vessels totaling around 600,000 car equivalent units joined the world fleet. The order book at one point represented roughly 37% of global fleet capacity, and a striking share of those new ships were not going to traditional shipping lines at all. They were going to manufacturers. Charter rates, having peaked above $110,000 a day in 2023, were forecast to roughly halve within 2 years. Asset values followed. New orders for car carriers collapsed to just 6 vessels in 2025, with a combined capacity of 22,000 cars, before rebounding in 2026 as Chinese export volumes kept climbing. Read that sequence carefully, because it is the whole story in miniature. The shortage created enormous profits. The profits attracted new entrants. The new entrants were the customers themselves. And once a customer has bought a ship, it does not go back to renting one when rates fall, because the ship is already paid for and the control is worth keeping. Some of that capacity has permanently left the charter market, and it left carrying a car maker's logo on the hull. If you are finding this useful, take a second to like the video and drop a comment, because the comments genuinely shape what gets covered next, and share it with someone who follows either cars or shipping, because almost nobody is connecting these two stories.